Hello and welcome everyone, it's Morgana here with today's demonstration. Today I'll be showing you how I painted this beautiful wistful summer poppy field. To begin with, I masked out my key flowers, my poppy blooms and the little seed heads and their buds using masking fluid. This is the reference photo I'm using for this piece. I'll pop a link down below. You can see that I've actually flipped and reversed the image to have my poppies leaning the other way. This is simply personal choice for me, as I'm very right-handed and tend to paint most happily leaning from left to right. This is obviously something you can adjust and change depending on how you're the most comfortable painting. So to begin with, I'm wetting the bottom 2/3 of my paper. This is going to be our lovely field. And I'm introducing the colour with my large 2-inch wash brush. This is some raw sienna to begin with, lovely warm golden yellow to begin as the foundation for our warm summer meadow. And now I'm introducing a lighter and brighter yellow. This is Gamboge yellow, and I'm introducing it mainly along this midsection because I want a little bit of paleness along the top of that third, and along the bottom we're going to introduce a decent amount of greens for our meadow grasses and the poppy stems. So I mainly want to focus this really lovely bright hued yellow along the central band of this paper. And you can see here the green starting to go on. This is sap green that I'm using today to begin with because I find it mixes beautifully with the Gamboge yellow that I've just put on and becomes even more bright and even more vibrant. Perfect for summer. And you can see to start with I'm putting it on really quite wet and really quite sort of wildly using my big old flat brush to begin sweeping it irregularly up the page to imitate the thick sort of dreamy stalks of grass and sort of meadow foliage that are going to be coming up and leaning from left to right, giving a lovely directionality to this piece. I'll be working basically beginning with the larger brush, transferring down to smaller and smaller. You can see here I've switched now to a mop brush. This is a synthetic mop brush and it has a lovely rounded shape coming to a delicate point, which enables me to do these slightly smaller sweeping movements. This is Pearline green I'm introducing here just to start to give a little bit of depth and shadow to our green grasses. You can see I'm still just using these quick spontaneous brush strokes and not worrying too much about it being symmetrical, just trying to follow the general directionality of moving from left to right for the majority of the grasses, mixing the greens up a little bit here with the yellows and just getting some really lovely different colours and shades and depth. Introducing some more yellow. What I did there is I just scooped a little bit of extra yellow up without washing my brush, so it's got that green tint. So I'm almost putting on a two-tone colour, which you can see there is diffusing beautifully because the paper is still nice and wet at this point, especially along the bottom. So we're getting this lovely soft diffused background. This is going to be our lovely background meadow grasses, and we're going to paint in some more detail later. And now I'm switched to an even finer brush. This is a sword liner brush. Some people know them as a dagger brush. They have a lovely curved point, and I'm using it to put in some smaller lines in the middle distance here. This is our background field, this lovely strip of yellow we planted across the midsection of our paper. I'm now introducing some much finer lines here, which are again going to diffuse down a little and soften in the wet paper that's already there, but they're going to give the illusion of some depth and some distance in our poppy field. So we have these lovely flowers we've already masked out in the foreground, and this is going to give us the illusion of that field stretching on into the distant horizon. And again, using this fine liner brush to introduce a few more finer lines into the foreground as well. Of course, at this point it's entirely up to you how many different colours, shapes and different types of lines you want to introduce. For me, I love to have variety, so you can see I started with the big flat brush and sort of gave that lovely sort of thick base of colour which you can still see peeping through, and then worked down to smaller brushes to give a little extra sort of detail and that illusion of, you know, reality, sort of a little bit of life in this lovely meadow. Now again, working with my large 2-inch wash brush, I'm just putting in the sky here. I don't need a complicated sky. I think our field is the star of the show of this particular painting. So I'm just using the flat wash brush and doing a clean wash of sky blue across the top here. This is Davidson's Pigments Sky Blue, but you could also use a beautiful cerulean or a turquoise or something like that, or perhaps even a cobalt blue if you want a slightly different tinted colour. But for me, I think something a slightly green hued blue, like a cerulean blue, works really well for a lovely bright clear summer's day. And now across the top of the field, I'm putting in a little bit of a distant tree line and using Perylene Green and using the wash brush here to just pull up a little excess water that's started pooling down where I put the wet sky wash in. You can see it's drifted slightly down into our field, so I'm just sort of pulling the water out quickly with the flat brush before it forms any cauliflowers. Now coming in again with the flat brush and again with some lovely Perylene Green, this lovely dark rich green, and I'm just introducing a very loose horizon, sort of distant tree line. And as you can see, I'm not worrying too much about doing, you know, terribly detailed trees or branches or shapes. Also because we're using wet and wet technique. Again, here our sky wash is still wet. As you can see, I'm putting the Perylene Green on just in these little dabs, creating these lovely loose, spontaneous, natural looking shapes of sort of trees and hedgerows and little bushes and shrubs poking up in the distance, and allowing it to diffuse into our lovely wet sky here. And now as this paper is drying, it's taking the paint slightly differently. We're still getting some diffusion on these grass lines I'm popping in here, but not so much. They are remaining a little bit sharper. They have a little bit more clarity than the lines we put in first when the paper was very wet. And I'm just popping these in quickly whilst the paper is drying to get some different lines, a little bit of extra variety into our lovely poppy field. Again, just using exactly the same colours, mixing up the sap green, a bit of Perylene Green and some more Gamboge yellow. And now using a fan brush and just tapping it lightly against the handle of another paintbrush, I'm putting in some spatters whilst this paint is still wet. I'm using a purple for this. Just wanted a little pop of extra colour into our field, other than the poppies, of course. They're going to pop out really nice and brightly when we do paint them. But I think a little extra spatter of another bright colour really brings this to life, because of course you always get lovely different coloured flowers and plants in a natural meadow. So using the purple here, just spattering it in, just gives us a hint of those other flowers and plants lurking beneath the surface of these lovely grasses. I'm also popping a little bit of the extra purple into the horizon line here of this painting, just to add a little depth and a little extra shadow. And now we're using the salt technique, using some cheap table salt. This is going to give a lovely wistful effect to our painting. You want to pop the salt on when the shine has just come off the paper, but it's still damp, so it takes the salt. And what the salt crystals will do is they will form these pretty little dainty white blooms across the surface. You want to scatter it quite lightly. You can see I'm going over and scattering quite carefully. Here it is after about a minute. You can see along the top third we're getting these small blooms appearing, these little white blooms. And this is it when it's dry. You can see the salt has really bloomed across the sky there where the painting was wettest. Haven't had as much of the effect down on the bottom left, where the painting didn't quite take the salt very well, because the paper was really quite saturated and it didn't form the proper sort of, you know, those delicate little crystal effects that you can see along that top third. But that's okay. It's always a little bit of a gamble when you use salt on a painting, because it certainly has a mind of its own, a little bit like watercolour itself. So I'm really pleased with the effect here. With the salt, we've got this lovely distant sort of effect of little white flowers or almost seed heads coming up off this field. We're going to incorporate that beautifully into our overall painting. It's just another extra little effect. Of course, you don't have to do it if you don't fancy it, if you don't have any salt, or if you'd rather just use the pure watercolour. All I'm doing now is just using again the liner brush to introduce some different shapes and textures into the foreground now that the painting is dry. So I'm doing these long lines and little delicate strokes coming off them just to imitate different styles and shapes of grasses. As you can see now, this paper is completely dry. We're able to put on these lines and they stay really sharp and really clear. They're sort of focus lines, if you like. This is the, if you imagine a camera lens looking at this, this photograph, these lovely sharp clear blades of grass would be in the foreground. They'd be what the camera is focusing on, whereas the lovely wash that we put down before, which is now dried, is the sort of forming the hazy meadow background. So now I'm using a texture brush. You can use any brush you like for this, even a toothbrush will do, but this is my Matthew Palmer Tree and Texture brush, and I'm using it to introduce a little bit of stippling along the bottom here, along the foreground, just to introduce a little bit of extra texture and detail and really embed these grasses into the frame, into the picture, so to speak. I'm starting with a light pale green. This is watered down sap green with a touch of yellow. I'm going to work through and introduce a little bit of perylene into the mix and layer up some darker colour. And as I said, this is just a little extra detail just embedding those lovely long lean grasses we've got into the sort of darker, sort of denser, more foliagey grasses you often get at the base of these sorts of clumps of meadow grass, meadow flowers. So you can see I spent a little time building up the green here. Now I'm coming in with a little bit of extra colour. This is a little bit of extra yellow that I'm bringing in here just to give a little more detail. Love having all this beautiful sort of spongy texture in these sorts of meadow painting. I think it just adds the illusion of these lovely little details, these little flowers and plants popping up all over the place in the distance. I just love having this amount of detail, which you can put in so easily with one of these foliage brushes. I think it's a wonderful shortcut. You can see I'm just dabbing the yellow over the white blooms that the salt made here across this top line, just to incorporate that salt a little bit so that white's not just sort of standing out starkly. Little dabs of yellow across there help to make them look a little bit more like a swathe of white flowers in the distance, I think. Now I'm introducing a little more purple into this painting, again with the foliage brush, just dabbing on some more of our lovely violet colour. Just carefully, I don't want to overwhelm the painting, and of course do remember we still have the red poppies to pop in. I don't want to overwhelm it with dark colours or with the purple, which you'll notice darkens down a lot when you add it to the green and the yellow. It tends to get a slight brownish hue, which I quite like because it gives a little bit of extra colour and a little bit of extra darkness into the foreground. And you can see I'm still popping it on quite lightly up on that top third band there. Now just doing a little bit more spattering again with the purple to introduce some sort of spontaneous little blooms of extra colour. Now that that's all dry, I'm able to remove the masking fluid from my poppies just by rubbing gently with a finger. You can also use a rubber or an eraser to do this carefully. Just make sure you brush off any crumbs of latex that are left over. You can see I've removed all the masking fluid. I've left my poppy blooms clear and white. You can see I've just gone over these little stems and these little buds with a really pale green, and now I'm using a fine detail brush and a mix of sap green and the cerulean green just to darken it down and deepen it up a little bit and bring in some detail and bring in some darker colours. So you can see here this lovely poppy bud is really starting to come together. We're using both the spring green and the perylene green. You can see I'm using the perylene quite heavily around the base of the bud and on the stem, because I want these lovely poppies to stand out a little from the beautiful meadow we've created. They are the star of the show after all. So I'm using the perylene to introduce some darker colours around the base of the bud to give that little bit of shadow, a little bit of extra detail on these buds. And on the seed heads as well, I'm using the perylene to introduce a little bit of shadow under the little caps, the little seed caps you've got here, and around the sides again to create some extra detail and shadow on them. There we go. Filled those all in now using exactly the same techniques that you've just watched. And now it's time for our star of the show, these beautiful poppies. I'm using the mop brush here, and you can see I'm just pressing it into the paper and using the shape of this brush to get those first initial petal strokes done. I'm using vermilion red here from Davidson's Pigments, lovely and bright. You can see it's just immediately this mop brush has given us that perfect shape for that first petal. I'm introducing a little bit of extra rich pigment at the bottom and at the top of the petal, using plenty of water as well, so it creates a little bit of dimension within the petal. It's not all just one big block of colour. I'm also going to add a little bit of extra orange as well in there in a minute, just to brighten it all up a little bit. So I'm sort of leaving space for that, if that makes sense. I'm also leaving a very, very slim white line between these petals. You can see there just a little bit of the white paper peeking through, just to give the illusion of sunlight glinting off the edge of these petals, and just to differentiate them out a little so they don't look like just one big red blob. And here we are, this is the orange. You can see I'm quite carefully just popping it in there, just dropping it in with the tip of my mop brush, and allowing it to run wet and wet into the red, and sort of create this lovely almost abstract sort of mixture of red and orange, which I'm not controlling. I'm just popping it in and letting it do its thing, which I think is one of the best ways to paint flower petals. I love how this orange mixes with the vermilion to give, if possible, an even brighter and more vibrant colour. So doing the same procedure again for this one, starting with the top petal, filling in the main shape of it using the press of this lovely mop brush with its rounded edges to give us that lovely sort of natural looking petal shape. Just feathering the edge there slightly with the tip of the mop brush, because these poppies, they have this lovely ragged edge to their petals, which is really appealing, so I want to make sure we include that in the painting. And again, I'm also going to leave a very thin white line between these petals, just to differentiate the shape and just to make sure we've got a clear distance between those petals, so they don't sort of just merge and sort of run into one another. To see, I'm using quite a lot of water there as well to get this the red and the orange to flow and combine beautifully. You can always use a piece of tissue or kitchen towel to dab up the excess water if you're very, very careful. There we are, just dropping in that orange again, just popping it in there nice and quickly and carefully, just with the tip of the mop brush, and letting it blend and diffuse beautifully into our vermilion. And dabbing up those extra few little runaway spots of vermilion there that escaped. That's not too much of a problem. I just don't want I don't want to accidentally put my hand in it and smear vermilion all over the painting. That would be a shame, wouldn't it? I'm going to spatter some red across this field as well after the fact, after I've done this, so I'm not too concerned about any spare drops of red or orange going wild here. Now all I'm doing is just adding a little bit of extra colour to the tips of these poppy buds here, just Nice to have the impression of these buds about to burst open into bloom before filling in this last flower, which is a little smaller than the others because it's a little further away. I'm getting that lovely sense of distance here. Just using exactly the same technique of filling that brush up with some pigment and water and just pressing it gently but firmly into the shape of the petal. Now, just for an extra little detail here, you often get these lovely rich darker spots at the base of the poppies, and for this I'm using Payne's Grey, again dropping it in with the very tip of that mop brush and letting it diffuse out into this very wet paint we've got here on the petals. You can see even as I'm going and painting the other ones that it's continuing to move. You can actually watch the paint run on screen along the bottom of these petals, because that's where the water is collecting. Again, if you're not a fan of that, you can use the edge or the corner of a piece of tissue and carefully dab that up. But what I've done there is I've just set that board flat and let it dry naturally, and you can see it's dry now, and we've got this lovely natural looking diffusion of the Payne's Grey, which is the dark colour that I've used, going up and into those poppy petals and giving it that lovely extra little bit of detail and looking really lovely and natural. So the last real step here is to make sure that our poppies are firmly embedded in the landscape. Seeing as we did them with masking fluid, there's always a danger there that they look sort of plonked on top. So I'm using again the same techniques before with the liner brush and the stippling brush to just really try and embed those poppy stems into the foreground here, bring up a little bit of foliage, a little bit of shrub around them, and make them look like they're growing up out of the foreground rather than just being plonked on the top of it. So once you're happy with how they look and how they've been embedded into the foreground, you can see I've covered up a lot of that white but left a little bit peeping through. Just for a finishing touch, I'm spattering some more of this beautiful red vermilion across the field to give the impression of this lovely light lifting up off this poppy, off these beautiful petals, giving a little bit of extra bursts of colour into this field. This is entirely an optional step. You can leave it looking beautiful if you like without the red spatters, but for me I just love the impression of this red sort of glistening light lifting up off these poppy petals and just really introducing a little bit of extra pops of colour along the mid-section of our beautiful meadow. Here we are then, this is the finished painting. I've taken the masking tape off around the edges, so we've got this nice clear white border. So there we go. Thank you very much everybody for watching. I really hope you enjoyed the video, or at least found it interesting or picked up some useful techniques. Feel free to visit my Patreon page, which I'll link below if you're interested in any more of my videos. So yeah, thank you everybody for watching. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time if you're here, and I can't wait to see you all again in the next video.